I mean, what we're trying to do in the Ecofiscal Commission is to focus attention on these important issues of climate change. And it's really important at the moment because this has become a very polarizing or polarized conversation where good sense and good reason and often the public interest is not served. So what we're trying to do today is to pragmatically bring that back down to ground. What are the real issues we're trying to balance here? And as Chris said, the most important one I'd like you to take away from today is that balance of if you want a healthy environment, you need a healthy economy. If you want a healthy economy, you need a healthy environment. And I've got a speech here that I will go into in a second, but there's a second single thought I'd like you to take away. You know, I am an energy scientist, have been for 40 plus years. I have great ambition for the world in terms of where it goes in that energy mix and how we balance it. It is almost impossible for a normal person, including me, to understand what 1 degree centigrade in planet temperature means. It's even more impossible for most people to understand what 400 or 500 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere means. What they do understand is that in the developed world, since the Industrial Revolution, and which is the energy revolution, by the way, life expectancy has doubled. That's the sum of the environmental impact of consuming energy more effectively. Doesn't mean there aren't negatives and things we have to work on in the environment. Doesn't mean there aren't lots of benefits which come. But when we net the costs and benefits out, it's been very much in the interests of people and human beings. Now we have to look at that. But we do have the other reality is we have a population going from 7 billion to 9 billion people by 2050. So we have to look at how we can responsibly help that growth happen. So those are the reasons why the Ecofiscal Commission are there, trying to get that intelligent, practical conversation going. You find, as Chris was saying, the representatives are interesting. They're from right the way across the political spectrum, right the way across academia, from industry, and from the environmental community as well. So we have some real fun debates when we start talking. And we're trying to take that partisanship out of the conversation. And that's helping us to get to those meaningful conversations so we can address the real environmental challenges and the real issues around climate change. And we're trying to move Canada to a position of leadership. That's not how we're viewed around the world at the moment. We're viewed to be quite the opposite. And what we want to do is get us into that position of leadership, bringing the best ideas forward and then applying them in the workplace. So the conversation we're having is a very important one. It's very topical at the moment. As you know, there have been conversations at all levels of government, including the federal government over recent weeks. And in fact, governments around the world are preparing for the conversation as we move towards Paris at the end of the year. The hope there is that for the first time in 20 years of these UN negotiations that have been going on, that a binding universal agreement on climate change will emerge. I did meet with the UN ambassador who's running those negotiations a few weeks ago, and she is very optimistic that every sign of real progress is there. And Canada, the reason she was here in Canada was because she viewed it to be one of the most important conversations that we really couldn't stay in the position we were in and how we're viewed by the rest of the world. And it's good to see that the 2030 targets that the federal government have put out there are ambitious and starting to be part of a bigger global plan. And of course, we did hear from the federal government about that 30%, and now we've got to talk in detail about how we do it. But, there's definitely some real ambition and some real stretch in there. If you look around provincial governments, you see that, Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec have mechanisms for pricing carbon. Some in great detail, some still to be defined. And of course, with the new Democratic Party here in Alberta, then we're going to see even more focused attention on the path forward for Alberta, which is a good thing. And that's going to present the industry with some challenges. I mean, all of this is happening whilst we have a world of low crude prices, and it's very difficult for us to predict exactly where those prices are going to go. So very important we get this context of environment, the health of the economy, Canadian competitiveness, and the environment all in the same conversation. You can't have one without the other. If you just unilaterally make progress on one, you will impact the other one. And you know, what the Ecofiscal Commission is trying to show is that these are complex relationships. They're very intertwined, and they can't be separated when it comes to government policy. And it's that simple concept of you can't have a healthy economy without a healthy environment. You can't have a healthy environment without a healthy economy. And that's the conversation, you know, if I put it in a nutshell, that I hope we get to today. Today's conference title is Carbon Pricing and Alberta's Family Business, and it's there meant to start provoking some thought. You know, we like to think, particularly in Alberta, of ourselves as great entrepreneurs, very strong around family, very strong about the breadth of our economy, and it's important that everybody feels part of the conversation. It does require of the industry to be world-class in terms of innovation and new technology, and that's whether you're looking at technology to unlock the potential of the oil sands, or working together on those broader environmental challenges. And the industry is trying through that process to raise the bar, and is starting to turn heads around the world. Chris mentioned the Canadian Oil Sands Alliance, and there are a lot of us who are very proud of that. It's a leading example around the world of how competitors can innovate when they have a common interest. And that polarizing common interest for the industry here is the environment. And a lot of the academics around the world, a lot of the global leading corporations are paying a great deal of attention to COSIA because they want to be part of it. And they see it as absolutely world-class in its scale and level of ambition. It's attracting the very best companies in the world to come in here and see this as a centre in the world for in innovation. Of course, when we get beyond, and we will get beyond some of these discussions, what it will leave is a different way of thinking around innovation, around technology, around a broader economic base for Alberta and Canada. Worth remembering, amongst all of the criticism that Alberta takes, that it was the first province to act on climate change through what we called the Specified Gas Emitters Regulation. A lot would criticise it now in terms of its level of ambition, but let's remember it was the first in a world where others weren't paying. We were actually squaring up to the need for it and channeling those funds into innovation and technology. So getting an early start in terms of the things we can usefully be spending money on. I like the family title for the day because it also gives us a context around some of the risks that we potentially have. So, controlling costs is an important part of our world. We do need to make sure that the costs we incur can be supported by our business model, by the market conditions. And, simply put, I think that means we have to stay competitive. If we tax the industry to a point of being uncompetitive, then the environment will suffer. There will be no employment, there will be no basis for taxes. Royalty debates are interesting, but if there's nothing to tax in the first place, then they're not going to be very fruitful. So we want to take that long-term view of getting the balance between environment and economy. We can't just focus on short-term benefits. It's important to put Alberta in the context of Canada. Alberta's family business is also Canada's business. This is a very important part of Canada's economy. And Alberta's ability to thrive directly impacts Canada's economic prospects. Whether that's job creation, whether it's in the supply chain, whether it's taxes, whether it's royalties, those things right the way across the country have a significant impact. As we move to ensure economic prosperity, we do have to remember the critical nature of environment. And we'll be talking a lot about that over the next half an hour. But there are three characteristics that should define our efforts as we go forward. The first one is the pressing need to stop talking and taking action. Climate change is happening. Doing nothing is not an option we can choose. It's important we remember that right at the start. Now, in addition to the Ecofiscal Commission, there are various voices that have contributed to the conversation. I just wanted to highlight one, and that's David Keith, who's worked at that difficult intersection of climate science, energy technology, and public policy. And I would encourage you to go away and check out his interview with Jim Brown on CBC Radio, where he pointed out the need to embrace what he called an eco-modernist manifesto. And his point is that we need to be deliberate in the actions we take and embrace technology to get to a better future. And it really is worthy of having a look at that interview. It highlights some very basic ways where technology and a more modern approach can actually have a very beneficial effect on productivity and the environment. The second point that I'd like to bring out is the need to be innovative and to be bold. We do need to find ways to tackle this issue. We need to remember that 80% of the CO2, and all of this is about global CO2. It's not about, doesn't matter whether it's CO2 here, doesn't matter whether it's CO2 in the province next door, doesn't matter whether it's in the US. All that matters is a CO2 molecule equals a CO2 molecule anywhere in the world. And one of the important messages I want to get across is that when we go ahead with policy, it's really important we target all of that. At the moment, we often talk about the supply side of it. It turns out that 80% of the CO2 production is at the point of combustion or the point of use of particularly oil, gas, and coal. So it's really important as you develop policy that you don't go past that 80% and leave it there. It's not always politically convenient to do that, because that means it's getting to a much broader-based carbon fee at that point. But I think when you get to good reason, when you get to what the Ecofiscal Commission is trying to push, the nearer that you can get to these, the broad base of CO2 emissions, the more effective policy will be. If we're truly going to get and invest in the technology, we also have to look at that demand side as well as supply side. So, efficiency of use, the way we use, the mix of energy becomes very important to us. Now, I do want to say right out of the gate as well, we do believe that the Canadian oil sands are an absolutely world-class resource. They need to be developed in the context of the energy mix required for us to go forward. And it's important that that is done responsibly to meet the global demand as we move towards that target in 2050 of nearly 9 billion people. So we believe a critical resource that needs to be responsibly developed. We support public policy that's broadly based across the economy, drives the best achievable performance from the existing facilities we have and the new facilities we put in, provides clear support and positions Canada and Alberta as a leader in both in developing technology and applying that technology across the world. Given the size and scale of our resource, the only place we can be is at the leading edge of best practice, and that's what we have to do. We have to develop it and apply it. And of course, that means ambitious targets as we do that, and all of that has to be in the context of a competitive Canadian business environment. So, and then finally, my third point would be we need to, and we've sort of coined it as we need to embrace the concept of directional leadership. And what I mean by that is, you know, scientists have told us about CO2 and the impact it's having. But Canadians are looking for us to take action. And we don't have all of the answers, but that doesn't mean we can't kick off and we can't start working on this. So that means developing and yes, I think it also means testing policy solutions to drive behaviours in the right direction. And one example I'd like to use of that type of thinking is what happened in the City of London, which was aimed at reducing the congestion there. It's not something that people would have thought feasible, but it is working. You know, literally, it helped to reduce the number of vehicles on the London streets. And for anybody who goes through London, it feels different now as a result of that innovation in thinking and the willingness to try the policy and see what happened. And they've made some modifications to it as it's gone. A global, international or national framework is not in place yet, but that doesn't mean we can't get good public policy across the continent, which is starting to move in the right direction. And think of seatbelt legislation. You know, there wasn't a universal global belief that would happen. It started and then it grew, and now people feel uncomfortable if they sit in a vehicle without a seatbelt on. So kicking off and starting action before you have all the answers is important, especially when things are as complicated as this file. So we think the right place to start is in the provinces, much closer from a regulatory perspective to the issue, and we've already seen that start to happen. It's important, though, not to underestimate the power of coordination between the jurisdictions. In the end, it is what's required to ensure that we make the meaningful progress. And I'm optimistic on that front as well. The premiers are talking about how they can start to have individual policies, and those policies add up. And of course, that initiative is now putting the federal government under some pressure to start to have a more nationally coordinated focus. The challenges we face on climate change and public policy certainly are, not easy ones. They loom large, and it's why these type of discussions are important. Like the hurdles, and I'll go back to that family business model, they do require some conviction, they require determination, they require hard work, they require collaboration, and particularly when you set that objective of having a healthy environment and a healthy economy at the same time. It's not one or the other. You don't give one up to have the other, but you have to work really smart on public policy to be able to achieve it. That's why I'm optimistic that bottom-up is right, because then that policy can be sensitive to individual industry and provincial needs. And that's shown to be the case. If you look at how the policies are working across Canada, very different in their design, and having different impacts in different provinces. In short, the path forward really is about choosing that energy future we want. In environmental terms, I think that means clean energy, as sustainable as we can get it. In financial terms, that means achievable, competitive, innovative, creating jobs and fueling the economy. In social terms, of course, that means it helps us to sustain the very fabric of society, education and healthcare. But we have to realise, as I've said, they're all linked. You cannot do one without the other. So complex challenges requiring collaboration. We do need to collectively face these complicated, multifaceted systems which are embedded in the very fabric of the lives we lead. So to make a change, we need to look at that underlying system, and we can do that. We can do that together, and sometimes we're going to have to have unlikely partners. For competitors within an industry to come together, for corporations and NGOs to work together. But if we share those objectives, then I'm confident we can do that. But we're really going to see the colours of these organisations. Who wants to move into the solution space? Who wants this debate to progress to somewhere better? So it's not simple, but it is too important to not get it right. So these conversations, taking the appropriate amount of time, is vital on that journey. Each of us as leaders has a responsibility. I hope everyone goes away from here having heard maybe some different things as the morning goes on, and start to get this conversation growing, because creating that sustainable future is very important. The timing couldn't be more important. We have the opportunity to work towards not just milestones here, but as I started, milestones here in the province, across Canada, and then across the globe as we move towards Paris in the fall. But as I say, balancing it with making sure the content is right is very important. We could do an awful lot of damage over the next few months and years if we get this wrong. So if there's a final takeaway message, it's let's take the time as a matter of urgency, but let's take the time, particularly in Alberta now, to get it right. You can tell I'm quite excited by this conversation. I'm pleased that the Ecofiscal Commission have worked so hard to get us there. I'm looking forward to having the conversation for the rest of this morning. I think it's going to be fun in terms of governments, others across the company, and I and Suncor are willing to take our place in that conversation. Thank you.